St. Paul's letters, this one addressed to the church in Galatia. Now, Galatia was a region and not a singular place. Rome and Corinth, the letters that we've seen already, these were large cities, and where there were undoubtedly multiple house churches, there were multiple places they would have met up, there was a singularness to the church of Rome or the church in Corinth. But in Galatia, you're talking about a region that surrounds modern-day Ankara, so a little bit in from the water. And so you'd be thinking something more along the lines of what we might think of as a parish. Something like Madison or Richland or, whatever parish. We would think of it as a county probably for people not in the United States. That's closer to what we're thinking of. So we're thinking of the letter to the Galatians not as one group, but as a series of disparate groups. And the letter to the Galatians is therefore going to be a little bit shorter because it's not as if Paul can simply address all the problems of everybody at once. So we're only looking at 6 chapters, and Paul has a much tighter focus in Galatians than he does elsewhere. Also, Galatians is written a good bit earlier. Remember that the letters of St. Paul are organized in the New Testament by the perceived importance rather than a sense of chronology or anything along the lines of that. And so the Galatians was written in 54 AD, which is a good 4 years earlier than Romans, 3 years earlier than Corinth, which is fairly long in terms of Paul's writing career. And so we're seeing a bit into the earlier Paul, his earlier teaching style, as well as what it is he had to say differently. But we're going to be revisiting some of the same themes that we saw in our last talk on 2 Corinthians. It's clear that the Galatians had a pretty good number of native Jews who were living in that area. If you remember from your history, we talked about the diaspora, how a lot of the Jews kind of got spread out, and Asia Minor, this is where this was an area where a lot of Jews ended up living. And so you had a lot of practicing Jews who were now converting to Christianity, and Jews, as part of the church, had certain challenges and difficulties that, say, Greek Christians would not have had. And in particular, the Jews had a thing about the law. In Judaism, holiness was equal to righteousness or piety, both of which are all about duty. You can hate the guts of your God, but do your duty. You can have no emotional connection whatsoever to the deity you worship and do your duty. And so the Jews are very, very much in that camp. And so the law was how you were holy. The duty to the law, obedience to the law is what holiness was for the Jews. And so it was very difficult for them to set that aside. And so Paul's biggest theme in the letter to the Galatians is that Christianity is driven by faith in Jesus Christ and not just by the law. It's not just about doing what you need to do. It's about a genuine sense of connection with the Lord. And that's why the first verse of chapter 3 is one of my favorite verses in the entire Bible, where Paul says in Greek, ho anatoi galatai, you stupid Galatians. It's just delightful. The modern kind of sweeter translation is you foolish Galatians. It's not a good translation. It really is you stupid, moronic, idiotic, doofus, goofballs. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by hearing it in faith? And that's really the thesis sentence for the bulk of Galatians is this very, very intense question of whether or not we are saved by faith or whether we are saved by law. Paul paints a picture of the law as a burden rather than a covenant. And he's doing this very deliberately, and he's doing this almost in a caricature sort of way. He's saying Christ has freed us from the law, and this is going to cause significant problems in our age. The Anabaptists of Europe a couple hundred years ago really got a hold of this and kind of separated it from its sense of context. A lot of Bible Christians nowadays don't read the Bible in context. They read the Bible in proof passages or proof quotes. And so if you take Galatians and you say all the other stuff doesn't matter, Paul says we are saved by faith. And the same thing he says in Romans, then you don't understand the context where Paul is trying to tell people who are functionally obsessed with the law that they are not saved by the law, they are saved by faith. Then you end up with this kind of modern Baptist nonsense that says, I'm saved by faith in Jesus Christ, I want nothing to do with of man, and I am saved and I'm done. And that's balderdash. It's completely ludicrous. It has no grounding in Scripture if you read even the slightest context of why Paul is saying what he's saying. And this notion of, I don't want anything to do with that which is of man is first of all, it's a bad translation from the King James, but it's grossly misunderstanding what Paul is trying to accomplish when he says that we are saved by faith. Not by the law, not by duties, not by actions, but by this connection with the Lord. And so in reality, Paul is not condemning rules and duty. In fact, he's talking about specific rules he once followed in this letter. He's explaining that the Jewish dietary and Sabbath laws aren't binding or necessary anymore. In a very, very real sense, when John Calvin says we are saved by faith, ultimately, Paul was looking up and going, no, you're not saved by not eating bacon, you idiot. There's a dramatic difference between those two ideas. Yes, doing nothing on Saturday is not equal to you don't have to do anything at all ever because the law is completely obliterated. That's not what Paul's getting at. The other part of the letter that makes it more fun to read than a lot of others is that, like 2 Corinthians, which actually takes place several years later, Paul has to defend his apostolic authority. He's dealing with a lot of Jews, and you can kind of imagine what's happening. So Paul has this group of people, and the Jews in this area he's talking to, get the big phone call, or they get the big letter, and it says, hey, we've got this cat named Paul. He showed up, he gave us Jesus Christ. We're super excited about it, taught us how to go to Mass, taught us how to do all this fun stuff. It's a hoot. And their relatives back in Jerusalem and back closer to the Middle East are going, Paul, you mean the same cat who was in charge of murdering everybody? Probably not your best guy to listen to. He's probably doing a trick or something like this. And just like in 2 Corinthians, where some random group of Jews shows up that we don't know about, they show up and they go, look, this cat is bad news. The same crowd apparently made their way to Galatia before that. And so Paul is basically going, listen, I'm livid about this. There's this kind of mild rage that underlies Paul going, I shouldn't have to defend myself to you because look at the things I did. Look at the works I did. Look at the miracles that were done. You don't need to have my bona fides, but if you want to know, and so we get these wonderful biographical details where Paul says, listen, you bunch of morons, I got knocked off the horse here. Then I went down here. I talked to Peter. And you know what? Peter and I disagreed, and I was right, and he was wrong. So suck it, Peter. You have this kind of wonderful over-the-top sort of moments that cause Paul to say in Galatians 3:1, you stupid Galatians. It all kind of stirs together into this wonderful borderline rage of what Paul is trying to get across. But there is some really interesting data that comes from that. And of course, this letter also reinforces for us just how isolated certain communities would have been. We tend to have the idea in our minds now about this kind of regular communication, and maybe we kind of write back and say, oh, well, this was closer to communication in Europe in the 16 or 1700s. But in reality, this is the kind of things where letters were not really sent. Letters were delivered. And if you had a friend who was going on a caravan to this place, then you could send some mail along. But some people could read and some people couldn't. And there really was this kind of much, much less, it's this much, much smaller world. And so or I should say a larger world. And so you have this very, very different kind of experience of what Paul is trying to get across. And so Paul's two big themes in Galatians are very, very straightforward. One, I'm a real apostle and you jerks should stop questioning that. And two, it is by faith and not by the law that we are ultimately going to be saved. And so it's not like just not eating bacon is going to get you into heaven. You've got to do better than that. And that's it. It's a very, very straightforward letter. It's so much fun to read. As you can tell, it's definitely one of my favorite letters. And Galatians has some of these very, very wonderful quotables that are really, really just kind of fun to absorb. By way of a brief outline, we can think of Galatians in 5 parts. We have a very brief intro, which is only 10 verses of the first book. Then we have Paul's defense of himself, chapters 1 and 2. We have Paul's defense of his doctrinal teaching, chapters 3 and 4. We have an exhortation on Christian freedom, chapters 5 and 6, and then a very, very brief conclusion, along with a warning from Paul where the finger wagging really steps it up a notch. And he probably has a slight wrist problem from all the finger wagging, and he can only get 7 verses out about his conclusion. So just very, very simply, Paul's defense of himself, his defense of his doctrine, his exhortation on Christian freedom, roughly speaking, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that's it. It's a really easy letter to understand, a really easy letter to absorb, but it is important to note those 2 major pieces of context. One, Paul is frustrated that the Jews in the community have kind of built in to the thinking, the idea that the law can save us, just Jesus plus the law, and that's not okay. And then the other one is the Jewish community from the outside that has come in and said Paul is not trustworthy, and he feels compelled to defend himself and explain why he is trustworthy. And so those are the 2 big reasons for it. Tomorrow, next time, we are going to be looking at the Ephesians, a letter that has a great deal more controversy associated with it. Ephesus is also a very, very different bird. We'll get into that when we get into it. But I've been Father Ryan Humphries. This has been the CU Catecast. Thank you for joining us. We hope we'll see you again next time.